When I was growing up, my parents used to buy my shoes at a little shop at the end of our block. There was something about the store's big chairs, with their smell of leather, that made the place seem luxurious to me. This was before the days of big box stores and discount shoe chains. Getting a new pair of shoes was always a big deal, an event that warranted a family expedition. It was also a minor drama whenever the new shoes were for my brother or sister instead of me. My mother's reasoned argument explaining that I didn't need a new pair of shoes brought no comfort. My anguish wasn't about need, it was about possession. As long as my brother or sister had what I didn't, I was certain I could not be happy. I might never be happy again. Envy is the devil's little hammer, bending our hearts until it turns us against anyone who possesses what we want. Envy poisons our desires and weaponizes them. Envy is part of a constellation of sins that the Apostle Paul labels the acts of the sinful nature or the flesh. This makes it kin to things like hatred, discord, jealousy, and selfish ambition. These days, envy is a brand used to sell any number of products ranging from perfume to healthcare to computer printers. It may be considered bad form to admit to envy in polite society, yet contemporary culture has legitimized envy in many ways. Why do we post so often about ourselves on social media? Could it be that we not only want people to rejoice with us, but also secretly hope that they will wish they were us? Envy collaborates with pride and anger. It was envy, in part, that prompted Jesus' disciples to argue about which of them would be considered the greatest. Pride motivated the Corinthians to divide into factions over their favorite teachers, but these distinctions were also intended to make those who identified with others jealous. Envy can even be a motive that drives our ministry, according to Philippians 1:15. Have you ever noticed how hard it can be to rejoice when someone else's church experiences more success than your own? But as is true of the other dangerous virtues, the ancients had a very different view of envy. Envy, you should know, is a disease more difficult to cure than any other sin, the 5th century monastic leader John Cassian warned. I would almost say that once a man is poisoned by it, there is no antidote, he added. The ancients considered envy to be Satan's sin, the one that caused him to covet God's throne and his glory. Envy was also the implicit motive embedded in the first temptation. Envy was the motive for the first murder recorded in the Bible. When the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, Cain grew angry enough to kill. Envy drove Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery. It was the motive that drove the Jewish religious leaders to hand Jesus over to the Romans. Envy is the sin of the have-nots, but that doesn't make it primarily a sin of the poor. The sin of envy is so ingrained in our fallen nature that it renders everyone a have-not. Envy is a gateway sin, opening the door to a host of other sins in the community of believers, like jealousy, anger, dissension, and evil. Envy infuses desire with spite. Spite unites itself with our ordinary desires in a way that blinds us to envy's deadly nature and distorts our view of those who have what we want. This distortion makes it easy to take offense with them. We complain about their faults, but the real truth is that we are offended by their prosperity. Envy is a kind of anxiety. It is an agitation of desire that combines lust with fear. Envy is destructive to the soul, even when the perceived inequity is real. The fact that the people I envy don't deserve what they have doesn't make my envy less destructive. Envy sours the heart, leaving us embittered toward those we envy and ultimately toward God. It makes us insensible of God's goodness. When my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was a brute beast before you, the psalmist laments in Psalm 73. All this began when he became envious of the prosperity of the wicked. We cannot simply talk ourselves out of envy. We must be delivered from it by God. If we're to recover from the sin of envy, God must also change the way we think about those we envy. This may be the most difficult aspect of envy, because envy skews our perception of others, persuading us that we deserve what they have more than they do. But we don't see others as they truly are. We don't even know ourselves for what we are. Such thinking usurps God's role as judge. More importantly, envy's skewed perspective fails to take into account God's goodness. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous, according to Matthew 5:45. The antidote for envy combines faith, hope, and love. Faith is the essential element because envy's power lies in its ability to cause us to question God's goodness and the wisdom of his provision. Envy exaggerates our desire until we become convinced that we cannot live without the thing we desire. Envy collaborates with lust and anger to build a false case against the one we envy and ultimately against God himself. Envy tries to convince us that we are fatherless orphans who must fend for themselves. Faith brings us back to our senses and gently invites us to question these assumptions. We know what we want, but we don't always know what we need. Faith is the voice of Christ, which reminds us that we have a heavenly Father who knows what we need. Faith is Christ's gentle rebuke, pointing out that while there are many things we want, there is only one that is truly necessary. It urges us to choose the good portion and leave the rest in the Father's hands. Hope bases its expectation on this confidence in God. It's not the crass hope of the prosperity gospel, which barters with God and trades devotion for trinkets. Instead, hope that is shaped by a biblical faith welcomes God's promises from a distance, as Hebrews 11:13 says. It is the settled assurance that God will do all that he has said. It is a conviction that true happiness does not lie in the things we desire, but in God himself. When we fix our hope on God, we find the freedom to love those we envy. This doesn't mean that we automatically feel better about them. Biblical love is not fairy dust that we sprinkle over our emotions to make all the bad feelings we have about people disappear. The dislike that envy instills in us toward others may continue, at least for a time. Biblical love doesn't begin with a good feeling, but with a disciplined decision to speak about and act toward others according to the rule of Christ. Love, in this sense, isn't necessarily a strong sense of affection, although that may come in time, but a disposition to act. Recovery from envy requires that we redirect our focus and reprioritize our desires. We don't need to stop desiring. Our desires need a conversion. This is true of desire in general, but it is especially true of envy. Envy is a kind of idolatry that values the gift more than the giver. The lie of envy is that we can make ourselves happy by what we achieve or possess. The true path to happiness does not begin with a vision of what we can achieve, but with a sense of what God has given to us. Envy cannot be tamed, it can only be thrown down. The longing for what others have, along with its corresponding desire to dispossess them of those things, can be eliminated only by suffering a kind of death. We must accept the loss in order to discover the gain. This is the message of the Beatitudes. It is the key to understanding Christ's warning in Mark 8:36. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? This is how ambition works in the strange economy of the kingdom. Only the losers win.